Good? Okay. Welcome to my talk. I'm Seven. I'm an alumni of Cogswell College. Let's talk UI UX design. So I work at ItsON Inc. in Redwood City. It's a telecom company. We're making it so that you can modify your cell phone plans off your cell phones. I also run my own startup in San Jose called Retrographic. We're working on a bicycle app called Sprocket. That's the shirt I'm wearing. And in fact, these are some of the main projects that I've been working on. Sprocket is the app that I've done. SoundHound is a major project I've been involved in, which identifies music. And Houndify is a project that just came out, also made by SoundHound. It's kind of a voice recognition assistant system. So today we'll cover what is design. We'll get into mobile app design. I'll talk to you guys about some problems and how I go about solving them. And then we'll cover getting a job and have some time before QA. So what is design? As you can see, that is pretty messed up right there. And you can immediately start to see how you would fix it, right? So people have been solving problems for a long time in many different ingenious ways. And design is actually everywhere and in anything across many different mediums. So if you take a coffee cup, you can take any coffee cup, but say you take a really shitty coffee cup, right? And you design a better coffee cup, even though the coffee is the same, the coffee in the better designed coffee cup will taste better. So if we take a coffee cup that is of any color, and we give you a white coffee cup, it's actually been shown that the coffee will again taste better. Now, they don't know why, but my theory is, because I'm a visual thinker, that when you're able to look at the coffee and you're able to appreciate its color and think about its taste more, that kind of cues your brain into thinking about the flavors you're experiencing. So then if we take a coffee cup, this is my least favorite coffee cup of all time, and we widen the base of the coffee cup so that it doesn't fall over, and doesn't spill hot coffee all over you, and it kind of can retain heat better, we're gonna have an even better coffee cup, right? And now we can, whoa, went out again. Okay, come on, cable. Oh yeah, okay, see, romancing the cable. So we can take the coffee cup and we can put a sippy top on it so it doesn't spill in your car or when you're walking to work. We can put a thermal band on it so you don't burn your hands. And we can say, without a doubt, that this is a better coffee cup than the coffee cup we started out with, right? So design, in terms of problem solving, yes, you could design something to be aesthetic in many different ways, but there is often one good way to design something, and there are often rules and kind of formalities around why you design something a certain way, right? So design is ultimately the effort to optimize the interfacing of systems. And it doesn't matter what systems, because we and our bodies and the building we're in and the cities we're a part of and the communities we belong to, they're all systems, right? Everything is a system. So design all the systems. Who remembers 2007? Right? So, not this guy, but this guy happened, right? This happened while I was at Cogswell College. And when this guy came out with the iPhone, it really revolutionized a whole lot of things, because right up until that time, phones really sucked. They had these hardware keyboards, they had proprietary software. There were a couple of companies that were trying to make inroads, like Palm, but on the whole, the other major issue was that to use the internet, you had to go to a terminal that was in your house, spend time logging onto the internet, and you couldn't do very much anyway, right? With the smartphone, it was the first OS that had desktop power. It had a fully capacitive touch interface, which was just amazing when it came out, believe me. We had CRTs. You have no idea. This was cool. And it had the App Store, right? So suddenly, you have a computer in your pocket that's accessible anywhere. It has internet running on it, and you're connected into the internet. As my favorite philosopher puts it, geography has been reduced to the human body and its proximity to a cell phone. So ultimately, in the future, we're going to something like this, right? On app design, we have the GUI. Who knows what the GUI stands for? Go ahead.
Graphical user interface.
That's right, graphical user interface. It literally means the user interfacing with the graphics. Okay, so the UI, the interface, is what I started out with in the industry at first, and it literally deals with all the illustrative and graphical aspects of the interface. I started out as a concept artist, and I started concepting video games, and that's how I got into drawing UIs for iPhones, and then later I migrated to UX. So UI deals with graphic design, illustration, typography, interface, assets, animations, specifications, things of that nature. So literally a UX guy can hand you a template or a wireframe, and you as the UI guy would put the UI on it. When you're talking about UX, you're talking about logic flows, hierarchies, business logic, screen layouts and wireframes, studying user data analysis. Come on, Cable, do your thing. See, this is an interface problem. This is like, how do you optimize a cable so that you can have a presentation that isn't going out? And it could be my computer and not the cable. That's also very likely. Okay, so those are the two. And in fact, when I started out, we had iOS 5 and iOS 4, and while they were really beautiful for the time, they were really gaudy. They had all these gradients and bevels and shadows and all this stuff. And I spent a significant amount of my time designing all this stuff. And absolutely inconsistent. It was hard to match the level of quality for everyone. So it was a big shift when iOS and Android went flat, because it suddenly allowed us as designers to focus more on the business needs and make better comprehensive UI decisions by taking more time to think through them than focusing on the minutiae of like, what does this button look like, and what are all the shadows changed like when it's pressed, you know, for every specific freaking button. And this happened on Android and iOS. So UX, you know, deals with paper. That's something I love to work on because I'm completely free and unrestricted. Wireframes, especially great for presentations when, you know, something like that is hard to explain to people. And then there's rapid iteration, where you might be taking high fidelity comps and going through hundreds of them and trying to iterate specifically for UX the position of elements on those comps, or the interrelationship of those comps and interactive prototypes. So this is a hierarchy map for a SoundHound, for example, right? This is all UX. So do you guys understand the difference between UI and UX now? Okay, because a lot of people don't, and a lot of people still come to me like, what do you do? Who are you? Which planet are you from? So, and then the terms of these continually evolve because this is a really new career path. And so even us UI UX designers haven't agreed on it all the time. I keep coming up to people that like think about it in completely different terminology, and it has only dawned on me now that the way to interface with people and get across to people what I specialize on out of all the possible combinations and permutations of things that I can specialize on is that I'm a mobile app designer, right? That immediately gets people that I do interfaces, that I do UI, UX, and that I focus on the specific type of hardware. Like I don't focus on watches or tablets or televisions or cars, and it sounds nicer. It's clear cut and nice. I'm a mobile app designer, right? So a UX consideration might be that you know, you have phones, you have two different types of phones, and depending on the kind of phones you have different app navigation schemes, right? So on iOS, you have the tab bar on the bottom because your home button is there, and you have other constraints. On Android, you would have tabs on top because you have a navigation bar on the bottom, so you don't really want them to collide. You don't want people pressing the wrong thing. So the two platforms, right? We have Google's Android, and we have Apple's iOS. There are some other phones, but they're not really a significant percentage, and both BlackBerry and Windows Phone have kind of died this year. So you probably all have phones. Can I see what kind of phones you have? Who has Android? Almost everybody. Who has iOS? Okay.
My phone is disabled at the moment.
Okay. Disabled is fine. But is it a flip phone or is it a specific OS?
It's BlackBerry.
BlackBerry. Okay, cool. You want to hear a short BlackBerry story?
Yes.
Okay, so we had pre-production BlackBerry OS phones in 2013, I guess, that they sent to us because we were designing sound help for them. And we got into like a lock screen widget for the clock or something, and we couldn't get out of it. So at some point there ended up being like 3 of us designers that were trying to like just get out of this lock screen, and then we had to reboot the phone. Of course we reboot it and it tells us like, oh, I see you rebooted me, like what was wrong? It's like, well, design your OS better. So unfortunately that's why, but they're coming out with Android BlackBerry phones, so there's hope for you.
Oh man, okay. I should adapt now.
Yeah, so Android controls roughly 70% of the market, Apple 30%. This is straight off the top of my head, but Google's Android is open source, so that's where you see different versions of it, like Samsung's Android, right, and Motorola's Android, and Verizon's Android, etc. Apple is integrated, premium, vertical, closed, but it allows them to do a lot of really cool things. Like they just added 3D touch to their phones, and they obsoleted all their old phones. Google can't really do that because Google doesn't control their hardware. So Google's stuff runs on Java XML. It's, again, open source-ish. And Apple's stuff used to run on Objective-C. They're now switching to Swift. So if you want to learn to program for these platforms, that's what you would need to do. Okay, so as a UI UX designer, mobile app designer, I design for a variety of different devices and screen sizes, depending on what the project demands are. Pretty much watches, phones, and tablets. Again, off the top of my head, watches are some small percent, like 2%. Phones are what most people use, and tablets are kind of recreational reading devices used by about 8%. Right now, I'm working on my bike app Sprocket. Like I mentioned before, I'm doing it exclusively on phones, exclusively in portrait, because I don't have the time or the energy to expand and support all the stuff having to do with tablets when so few people use tablets, right? There are many different ways that UI UX can be designed for, say, an entertainment app, like a video game, right? But there's only one right way to make a tool. So that's what I'm going to talk about. There are design guidelines, right? And they are crucial in understanding both how to design for these 2 different platforms and how to save yourself time and how to make things look beautiful and functional and meet the expectations that users have on these 2 platforms, especially when they are so different and when they try on purpose to be very different from each other. For Android material design, we're really designing with something that's called quantum paper, right? So this stuff is amorphous, it moves, it shrinks, it rearranges, it can bleed into itself, it can split apart, right? It can have ink on it, and most importantly, it can move on the z-axis. So it can move up and down within the constraints of the phone's thickness and cause drop shadows to form. Now this is an amazing new kind of thought process that Google came up with. The reason it's so awesome is because they're able to teach users what to expect from interfaces through the metaphor of a physical kind of interface. So without having to explain to users that, oh, this is like a box that came out of the side of the screen and you can swipe it away, the fact that it has a shadow and you know how you would interact with it in the physical world allows you to kind of make these light decisions without having to be bombarded with tutorials, without having to get lost as much in the interface. So you can see that. And the other aspect of material design that's very important is meaning through motion, right? So how elements move across the screen when they're triggered so that you always know physically where you are in space, that you always can comprehend what's happening and where you're being taken is crucial. But it also looks very beautiful when it's pulled off right. In our app, we added a search floating action button, or FAB, in the lower corner, and the simple animation that we did was to expand it so it kind of bleeds across the screen, and it turns into the search screen, right? And then the search screen is the same color as the FAB, so it literally feels like you're now in the search screen. But instead of just pressing it, you're kind of diving into it. So almost like when you're touching it, it's coming up to the glass and meeting your finger at that point, and you're jumping up on the Z-axis to search. And then when you're done searching in Sprocket, you fall back down into the app again. And wherever you land, the search FAB is there, floating over the content, waiting for you eagerly to press it again. So that's material. For Apple, they still haven't decided exactly what they want to do, but they are using drop shadows again. They are going through and having the illusion of materials stacking on top of each other. Their themes are mostly thin and sleek and, again, premium. They use a lot of blurring. They have a special chip on their phones that allows them to do this really well, and you can see it throughout the OS. Whether you're 3D touching on an icon, you're navigating through apps, and you can see some of the apps in the background of the app switching are blurring. You're in notifications shade, you're in search. So for these two platforms, we use only two fonts, right? On Android, we always use Roboto, and Roboto gets updated from time to time, so it's not the same Roboto, but we use Roboto. It's free. You can get it on the Google Material Design Guidelines site. For iOS, we use San Francisco. It's Apple's new font. As of last year, it has replaced Helvetica, which was a more open font. And these two fonts are optimized for a variety of devices and screen sizes and screen densities. They'll automatically change themselves to accommodate this stuff and be legible. There are various very intricate things you can do in code with spacing, especially on Android. If you want the kerning to be just right, if you want paragraphs to wrap in a specific way, you can only do it with these fonts. And with UI design specifically, you really want your users to get comfortable with your app and for your app to feel like it belongs in the ecosystem. So one of the ways that you do that is by using the same font that all of the other apps are using. Basically what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to use a different font in your project, you better have a really good reason for why, and you better know what you're doing, because there are so many other more important problems that you're going to be solving in your project as a designer that just going with the standard font actually plays in your favor most of the time. Now, these platforms are based on a PPI system, pixels per inch. With Android, they use DP, which stands for density independent pixels, and iOS uses PT, which means points, right? So the basic concept is, on a very shitty phone, you have DP or PT of 1-to-1, right? So one digital point, like in your file, equals 1 pixel. These are really blurry phones, like the iPhone 3GS is a 1-to-1 ratio phone. Retina is Apple's like 2 times, right? So in that case, 1 point actually equals 2 pixels, right? So you can kind of see as phones stay the same size, but the screens get denser. This system allows us to both make design decisions and make our templates and files so that engineers can implement them correctly. So we're usually telling them, you know, make the box this many DP or this many points or something like that. And we're setting up all of our master files, keeping all this stuff in mind. A concept related to points and DPs is tap targets. So humans have digits, they're of approximately a specific size, and so on Android it's 48 DP box, on iOS it's a 44 point box on a non-Retina device. And so when we're designing things like buttons, we're making sure that, first of all, buttons are at least this minimum size, if not larger, so that they're easy to tap for people. especially if they're visually challenged, they're in a moving mobile environment, they're distracted, or they have some kind of learning or visual impairment or something like that. As it scales, you can kind of start to see how we're using grids, and again, Android is on an 8-point grid, right? So like 8, 16, et cetera, et cetera. iOS is 11s, so that's like 44, 88, blah, 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 blah. And the system just scales. For design, we use templates. So oftentimes we don't want to recreate the default measurements and default UI over and over and over. So we look at something like Facebook's iOS templates and pull the basic iOS stuff out of there and then modify it to a great degree. There's also the material design guidelines templates in every single major format that you might want. Okay, so like the Professor Reed at Cogswell, he said be boring, right? So very inspirational. How are you being boring? So when it comes to designing an interface, being consistent and being boring actually plays into your favor. Like remember what I told you about fonts, right? So with Sprocket, the entire color scheme is defined off the app icon, which is green and white. So there's some subtle secondary colors, but primarily the whole app is this way, and it makes it consistent. It makes people trust in the service more, makes people fall in love with it more, and it makes it beautiful because it's not just about one screen, it's about going through the entire experience back and forth and really feeling the consistency in it. Atomic design is another major concept. Anybody familiar with atomic design? Okay, so what I talked about templates earlier, with atomic design, it really breaks down UI into atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, pages. So when we go through, we might build out a UI, right, at the start of a project. And then as we define what those components and subcomponents and atoms are, we're going to start to create master files that we have sitting on our file management system, where any team member can pull out like a search bar or something and know that it's consistent across the entire application, right, for a specific operating system. And in this case, you can see that there's like a search button, right, the search field, and a label, right, that's an atom. And a molecule is that stuff combined together, right? So you might see a file where you see this combination already, so you don't have to take these elements and stick them together every time, because that will lead to inconsistency. And then down the road, you're telling different engineers on different teams slightly different metrics, right? And nothing's really matching up. And then you can build pages, you can have preset pages. So for example, if Sprocket had a search page and I wanted to build a different search page somewhere, I could use the same template to make them look initially similar and then slightly customize them to the different needs that I had. UI assets, major part of UI UX design. So UI design, I'm sorry. So going through and setting up these master files, setting up automation systems to export them, and basically keeping them all in sync and making sure they're all organized and correctly structured. UI specifications. The dirty secret of UI UX design is that right now we have to do a lot of this kind of dull work. It's slowly going away and getting automated, thank God, because this used to take hours, you know, draw a red line, measure the distance, and DP, you know, write it out for your developers so that they know exactly what everything is. Most importantly is not the time that this takes, is that there's so many steps involved in this, and it's so tedious and boring that you're liable to make mistakes, and you're liable to make as many mistakes as with this pre-automated asset stuff. Like imagine I have 2,000 asset files like I had on a Verizon project, right? And I mislabel one of them somewhere. It is really time intensive then for QA to test every part of every interface and every phone density just to find that I screwed up one of these and the code isn't reading it. The programmers didn't know because they just threw it in the project, right, and thought that it was going to sync up. So having things automated both for assets and specifications reduces the amount of errors. And sometimes when you see assets screwed up in apps, like in Facebook, like they're blurry, right, or they're incorrectly positioned, it's actually because some designer screwed up and they didn't put the right asset in the right place in some way. Okay, steal like an artist, Rob Chayton. Anybody know Rob Chayton? Okay, so he was the student life advisor when I was here. Basically, what I do is I solve my problems by looking at how others solve those problems, right? Because I'm a busy designer, I have a lot to do, and if I can identify things that are easily solvable, see how other people solve them and navigate around both the minefields that they've already stepped through, and also learn and benefit from all the user research and all the failure that they've gone through, I can save my company time so that we can focus on the things that are unique to our applications and services that are really, truly hard, that we do need to spend a lot of time iterating, right? So for SoundHound, for example, they had a button that identified music that no other app had, right? So that's like a high value thing that is maybe more difficult to copy from other apps that you would want to spend a lot of time iterating. But basically what I do is I go on the app stores and look at the new hot apps. I check out what's trending, what's the best practice, you know, what is an innovative new pattern that's coming up, and I take a lot of screenshots. And by a lot of screenshots, this doesn't even cover it, right? I have folders of screenshots by device type where I go through and I unload hundreds of thousands of screenshots. And I take screenshots of anything that is remotely interesting, whether it's a new error, it's a unique button, it's the spacing that I like, whatever it is. And actually, when I started designing on Android, it wasn't possible to take a screenshot off a phone. You had to plug a phone into a developer-enabled computer, and you had to like take a computerized screenshot. So anyway, the point of this is that when you come up against a whole variety of problems constantly during the day, you can flip through thousands of screenshots, find every single screenshot that has something that would possibly work as a solution, then you can group those all together, and then you can try a bunch of them in series really, really fast, and no one will blame you for it, and it works out great. You end up with wonderful solutions. You can move on with your life. Last and not least, user test your hypothesis, right? Ultimately, in UI UX design, what I see often is people going and jumping to an assumption that's completely unvalidated, or they have the best intentions and the best information, and they believe that it will work, and it ends up flopping in the marketplace, right? So the best way is to go through and find coworkers and test it on them, then to go into the public and test it on the public, or through some service and test it in the service. Ultimately, maybe set up an alpha or a beta program or an A/B test, you know, and really bang on things and see what works. It's like the stupidest things have taken days of my life. You know, this specific icon, people weren't understanding what it was, and I had to iterate through it like 300 times before I got to an icon that worked. And one of the ways that I sped that up, of course, is I had thousands of screenshots, right? So I went through and went, this might work, this might work, this might work. And still it took me like a lot of effort. So don't assume that because specific humans you feel will do things a certain way that they'll actually get it, because you would be surprised. Problem solving. So people derp, right? People screw up regularly, and it's not just the stupid people, it's the smart people. Everybody stubs their toe, everybody messes up light switches, everybody zones out when they're driving. And so when you look at users in the mobile applications, they're like lava, right, flowing through your interface. And it's up to you to set up the pegs to navigate that lava of users where you want it to go and to do what you want it to do. For example, on SoundHound here, when iOS 7 came out, they added a new microphone permission, right? So basically, SoundHound identifies music by fingerprint matching it to a database, and if your microphone is off, you cannot do that, right? So people were getting a random pop-up, they were saying no thank you, and then the app wasn't working. So I designed this really simple UX flow that basically blocks them, says, hey, you're about to receive a pop-up that you ought to say yes to. If they say no thank you, it says, okay, and then it returns them to the screen again. So it basically blocked them from doing anything, and it made sure that they never got into the app in a broken state, right? Then they got their pop-up, and they could still screw it up by saying no, right? Because this is an OS level pop-up. This is not coming from our UI that we control at this point. And if they did that, you would go to a different blocker screen that said, you idiot, you said no. So now that you said no, here's a visual guideline of what you need to do to turn this thing on manually in Apple settings. And this worked really, really well, right? This is a solution I'm really proud of. Here's another thing, right? Like this was SoundHound's voice search that was using the proprietary Hound technology. And it was really neglected, and for some reason it was green, and it had a lot of things going wrong with it. So I fixed it, right? I went and looked at the HIG, clean and simple, used iOS blurring, removed a bunch of the other garbage stuff in there, moved the cancel button down, and basically colored everything to match the app's brand colors. This screen. Can any of you tell me what's wrong with this screen? This is SoundHound's old music result page.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
There's more options at the bottom than the choice to play the song.
There's a lot going on. There's more options. There are actions all the way at the bottom, right? So you kind of don't know what's happening. So here's what I did, right? I went through and said, okay guys, what does our app do? It identifies music. What does that mean? It means you want to see the album art, you want to know what the freaking song is, who it's by, and what album it's on, right? So you want to know that stuff in that order. And then after you know that stuff, you want to know what you can do with that stuff, right? So you want to see the actions. You don't want to see them like randomly all over the page. You want to see them under the important stuff you just read, right? Because we're talking not about like 10 people, we're talking about like 200 million people looking at this all the time and having it on their personal devices. So you want to preview the song, you want to favorite the song, share the song, maybe add it to your Spotify or audio playlist. Then, of course, you want to buy the song, right? You want to know how to do that on Android or iOS. Live lyrics is important, and then all the premium row stuff is also very important. So much clearer order of operations, one correct way to design this. I mean, I'm sure there could be other correct ways to design this, but this is quite optimal compared to what this was. Okay, Sprocket, right? I just talked to somebody about this today. We had a database that listed bicycles. We had a search bar across the top. I thought this was the brilliant idea, right, that I stole from Google+, and it was going to be the shit. And people were confused. They didn't know what this app did. They didn't know what they were supposed to tap on, right? Because they're looking for like a traditional spyglass. And then it was hard to reach. So what I've been doing with this app is going to bike parties and actually observing cyclists playing with my app, and that has taught me a lot. So what did I do? I put in that fab you saw earlier, and that fixed 99% of all those problems, because suddenly it's in ergonomically easy to reach place. It's leveraging material design so that you can see, you know, it's a thing floating above the UI that you should probably tap. It's using bold color. It has a pictograph on it of a spyglass. And it does that awesome motion wapow when you press on it. And here it is throughout the entire app. So that's another benefit, actually. That bar only existed on that page, and if you went somewhere deeper, you had to come back here to do it. Now you can do it throughout the entire application. Okay, this was a hack that I'm particularly proud of. So we didn't have a server, and we wanted to allow people to look at pictures and interact with them. So the way I cleverly offloaded this onto Instagram is by saying, okay, this post has these likes and these comments, but it looks disabled and you shouldn't expect to tap on it. And I actually tested this with a lot of people until I figured out that, you know, this look specifically, they knew not to tap on it. And then I made a out arrow with an Instagram icon, and when you tapped on it, the app basically checks to see if Instagram's installed or not, and then shows the correct pop-up for either the App Store to go into Instagram. So say you see this bicycle derailleur and you really like it and you really want to leave me a like or a comment, You can tap on that, that thing opens up, you tap on it, you go to Instagram, you do your stuff, right? You still got to do all the actions on the content in my app, but there was no server work involved. So there are all these clever solutions to all these issues that come up on projects, and they might be more or less complex than this. Once I had that system down, I used it in other places. For example, here I have an in-app rating system that encourages you to give me some stars. And basically, if you give me a low rating, I say, what can we improve? Go to the feedback page. Please don't give me a 1-star rating. And if they give me a 5-star rating, I say, hey, awesome. Now can you do the same thing again, but in Google Play? I'd really appreciate it because I would get ranked higher in bicycle searches. Same thing again, we ran into old devices, didn't have a PDF reader on Android, right? So what did I do? I went on Google Play and found that Google actually had their own PDF reader app. So same pop-up comes up. I say, hey, get the PDF reader from Google. They tap on it, they get it, then their thing works, then I know that they read the terms of service. Okay, this is very interesting. So this is a bicycle page. Since we started working on this app, we've gone up to 55,000 bikes, covering about 400 brands. We don't have time to curate images for all these bikes. That's a lot of bikes, right? So we use that same kind of offloading idea, that UX design. We said, okay, we're gonna search Instagram by hashtag for bikes that people have hashtagged by brand model. And believe it or not, we got a whole lot of hits that way, right? So we didn't have to curate images. We covered like a good percent of our database. I don't know if it was 50% or 30%, never studied it, don't care. But the other thing that was awesome is now people can add their own images to my app, and I still don't have any back-end stuff supporting that, right? So it's entirely a UI UX solution that allows people to have vastly superior functionality in the application without having to involve developers nearly to the extent that I would have had to otherwise. So let's go through some examples of things that are messed up that I found. I actually find things and tweet about them, and sometimes I tweet to the companies whose things I find messed up, and I've fixed a lot of things for a lot of companies this way. It's especially good when I'm fixing things for apps that I use all the time, because then I don't have to deal with shitty UX and UI, and it also gets better for a whole lot of people. This is Windows 7 error. I don't know what it says. I don't know why it came up, but I know it's an error. Why? Because there's at least an error icon. So this is an example of a use case that isn't being met. So it should have, probably said, oh, I know you have English, but I know the errors in some random language, so I'm going to switch it to English or something like that. But Windows is so complicated that there's so many of these things that fly up that they can't handle each edge case. And that happens a lot for a lot of these companies. When you actually start to look for UI UX bugs in applications and you're taking as many screenshots as I do, you find that most software is screwed up in many fantastic ways. This is Google. So what's wrong here is I'm giving a choice of one thing. This is Instagram. This is an impressively bad bug that they may not have fixed yet, and they should. You can see that there's 4 items. 3 of them are checked, right? And now I want to remove 3 geotags. But it's telling me that it's going to remove 1 geotag. What's happening? Anybody? The asset for the checkbox on and the checkbox off or something is reversed in their UI. So actually, that one is, the first one is the one that's checked, and these 3 are not checked. And I was pretty angry because I deleted a bunch of my geotags. I mean, it's no big deal, but it's pretty funny because Instagram is actually a really high quality app. They have a lot of users. They have a lot of money behind it now with Facebook, so they put a lot of time. But this is actually showing you something else. It's that this is an area of their application that, okay. So this is another fun example. This is an old ItsON interface. I hope to catch this one. Basically, there's a text string, right? And instead of having designed it correctly or have it truncate, they are squeezing the box vertically, so it's causing the text to kind of spill off all over the screen. This one was very, very interesting. It took me a while to figure out what I was screwing up on here as I was using it. Does anybody see how I would like this content? What would I do?
The heart.
Which one? Right? So there's a heart on top
Oh, yeah.
that you would use to favorite this piece of artwork, and there's a heart on the bottom. But the heart on the bottom actually tells you which 4 people favorited it. It doesn't actually favorite. But the thing is that I always miss the top one because when it's not enabled, it's a wire, and it doesn't catch my eye. So many times I would jump into this app, and this is a pretty small, like Dribble client app, and I'd press that thing, and it would do something I wasn't expecting, and then so it's these kind of things I have to watch out for that designers like me with a lot of experience know how to avoid or self-critique and find. This one's very interesting. So what I should have done is flip it on 2 pages, but I didn't. So this is pixel art, I believe, and we had this UI that came up from the bottom that was blurry and looked very much like the native iOS one, right? So the 2 problems here are, one, this looks like the native one, so it goes against the HIG, the Human Interface Guidelines that I talked about earlier, which means that users might be confused, like, is this Apple's OS that's coming up, or am I still like in this art app? And the other thing is, the interaction was to sweep it up from the bottom, I believe also. So am I going to trigger this thing, or am I going to trigger this thing, and like this thing is now overlapping this thing, like what's happening? So told them about it on Twitter, they just fixed it. This irks me to no end. So if you have an iPhone and you have AT&T and you enable Wi-Fi calling, then you end up in the situation where when you're within range of a Wi-Fi thing, it will send it by Wi-Fi. And when you walk out of Wi-Fi, it's going to switch to cellular network or whatever. I have that stuff disabled, so I have just the regular calling function on my phone. So when I walk out of Wi-Fi, what it first tries to do is to send it by Wi-Fi, stupidly, right? It shows me a bar moving across the top that always stops at like 90%. So I look at my phone, I see that it's giving me feedback that it's sending it, and I put it in my pocket, and then it fits. So there's been so many times when I've had urgent messages that I've been delivering to someone that have failed and actually had known that they would fail, but I was so busy because I'm using a mobile phone in a mobile environment, being distracted, right, that I forgot that it was doing that. And I pull it out hours later, waiting for a car to pick me up or waiting to meet a friend for some drinks. And I see this stuff, right? And then I get to say, try again or send the text. All I wanted to do is to send it as text automatically when it fails, because I already explicitly told it that I want to send this text message. So Tobias Marx is someone I interned with when I was at Cogswell, and one of his brilliant phrases was, what would Steve do? Steve would simplify. This is a Compass app from Apple that's underappreciated. If you go over from the Compass to the level, this is a really beautiful experience. This is the least amount of stuff I believe you could put. I don't think that this app could be designed any simpler. You just have 2 circles coming together when you're vertically trying to level something with the screen up, and as they meet, it changes color, and you know that it's level. This is YouTube, again, brilliant for the reason that you can now sweep content off to the corner. It will continue playing. You can get picture-in-picture. When this came out, all the designers went, ugh. This is SoundCloud. Again, very reductionist UI. You can tell how you would scrub through the song. When you tap on the screen, it uses live blur to show you that the song is stopped. You know, very nice. Instagram, blog it daily, use it all the time. They just have a lot of really good, solid UI decisions in their app. I mean, other than they use the iOS navigation UX on Android, everything else. So there's a lot to learn from the Instagram team as they go along and continue to make improvements and radical changes. But really great stuff in their app. This is Facebook Paper. They have a kick-ass team. They have a completely different radical UX approach. They have really beautiful animations in their app. It's basically a different Facebook client. I highly recommend you guys check it out. Okay, so last part, how to land a job, right? Basically, you guys know Photoshop, right? Right? Okay, does anybody know Sketch? Okay, Sketch is like Photoshop, but for UI, UX stuff more specifically. Photoshop was good because it was the best thing at the time for doing all the stuff that I do, but it's Photoshop. It's for shopping photographs, right? So it has a lot of really stupid things in it that like pop-ups that come up when you hit wrong key combinations. It has really slow processing because it's trying to do a lot of things, like 1,000 ways to do something, just like the Sketch. But basically, Sketch is the new hotness. Photoshop is the tried and true, right? And Photoshop is platform agnostic, meaning you can use it on Mac OS and Windows, and Sketch is Mac only. So that's kind of the downside. With Photoshop, if you want to automate the assets and the specs, like I said earlier, you would use something I found called PNG Express, which is a platform agnostic plugin for Photoshop. Basically lets you, like, say, measure me the distance between these two things in this DP value because my mockup is at this resolution, and it will automatically draw you the thing. And also, when I showed you that asset master file, I can have, instead of slices, a bunch of assets and folders, and the folders in the layer group name can have the designation for whether it's a PNG, an SVG, a JPEG, or something like that, along with the actual export file path, as well as the asset name. So for Android, it's very useful because Android assets for Android developers are organized in res folder and then different density folders, and then you have the assets, and the assets have specific names. So I'm able to tell Photoshop with PNG Express what those should all be beforehand, and I can see them and easily scan them before exporting, and then I can hit one button, and Photoshop will export automatically like 2,000 assets. It's fantastic, especially if you've done it manually in the past. Zeppelin is something that's Sketch only, and Zeppelin is the future. Again, the new hotness. So with Zeppelin, you don't need to semi-manually automate assets or specs. What it does is it basically goes through the Sketch file and figures out what the distances are between things at a specific density, and it figures out where the assets are that you've told it that are assets that are supposed to be exported at a certain size. So basically, Zeppelin is a window for your team's developers into Sketch, and they see into your Sketch file through Zeppelin, and when they mouse over things, Zeppelin will tell them the distances they need when they need them. So again, it's like magnitudes of order of work saved, and that means less errors made, right? So everybody wins. More automation, better. This is what the pipeline looks like if you're on the Photoshop side. You would be saving it into some kind of file management software. You would be using PNG Express or some similar tool, and you would be prototyping in anything. At this point, when I used Photoshop, I used Pop Prototype. And then if you're Sketch, you would be saving again to any kind of program, your master files or your asset files, and they would automatically sync, and then they would automatically sync to Zeppelin, which is what I've just started doing at work. It's brilliant, and they would automatically sync to Envision. So the beauty with this is that I have my file, I have all the screens and artboards for the UI I'm working on. When I hit the save icon, the prototype updates. When I hit the save icon on Sketch, and all the assets and all the specifications for the developer working on the project automatically update as well, which is fantastic. It's like butter. Okay, and then the new promise is Adobe's answer to Sketch is experience design. And experience design is kind of a combination of things that Sketch does well and things that Photoshop does well, and some of the prototyping tools that I've shown you guys, and some of the Zeppelin stuff. So it's still early on, and they're releasing a lot of updates. I believe they've only shipped a Mac client up to this point in 2016, but there's a lot of cool stuff happening with experience design. So in terms of communities, you guys would definitely want to get on Drupal as soon as possible if you're looking for a career in UI UX, because it's the best community, has a lot of cool stuff you can reference, it has a lot of things you can grab as templates, it has a whole lot of gooey, chunky art for designers. The other ones are Behance. Behance is great. Also, putting your portfolio on Behance. Downside of Behance, for whatever reason, last time I used it, their backend was messed up, so it would like remix my long portfolio pieces when I didn't want it to. But anyway, it is a good design portal. You can also try DeviantArt. Like I've seen some UI UX stuff on DeviantArt, but I haven't updated my Deviant profile in many a year. LinkedIn. Who here doesn't have a LinkedIn? Get a LinkedIn profile. Do it now. Okay. There are other ones that are good. For example, Dribble has a pro option, so you pay Dribble something like $20 a year, which is totally worth it. And you get to say, I'm looking for a job, I do this stuff, you get some analytics in your account, you get to attach more things to your Dribble posts. And then there's AngelList, right? I use it, I don't like it as much, but it seems to be up and coming and also a good resource. On your LinkedIn, don't have shades, please. Eyes, windows to the soul. People want to see who you are, what you're all about, and have a good picture, right? If you don't know if it's a good picture, use user feedback, ask your friends and family until you figure out what is a good picture. When you were describing your job, 4 bullet points, usually, will tell the whole story, right? Because a recruiter doesn't have time, they want to read through it as quickly as possible. And if you design your post, they will come, right? In this case, I'm saying I work on Sprocket. On Android, it's 9 GB for bikes. I do UI UX, I develop. I do database stuff because I've learned database stuff. I manage the business and the contractor team. I do marketing, and I do business things and forge relationships, right? That's all I need to say. And usually you would find that if this was 8 lines, you would be saying the same stuff with more fluff, right? You don't need to do that. Use liberally the UI template for inserting links of art stuff. For example, you can see a bunch of things that I linked from Dribble in here, right? Which then goes to Dribble if people press on it. We're visual people. This is helpful. Tip you wouldn't think of, don't put your date of graduation on your LinkedIn or on anything else because it doesn't help you in any way, it just hurts you. Because it just tells people that you're green. Oh, he's been out of college 1 year, so I know that he has 1 year experience, right? Whereas if you didn't tell them, then they would go, oh, he's done all this wonderful portfolio work. I wonder where he has worked or what projects she has done, right? I want to ask them about it. Like, basically what you're trying to do with your Dribble Pro, your LinkedIn, your AngelList, or whatever it is get your foot in the door so you can have that first email, you can have that first onsite. And if they ask you, go ahead and tell them, right? Or if they even ask you your college, go ahead and tell them. I've very rarely had people ask me where I went to college, and even fewer people, which is none, ask me when I went to college. People don't care, they don't have time. Agencies. If you're UI UX, it's hot in the Silicon Valley, on the peninsula, and in San Francisco, get yourself an agent. Agents will look for opportunities for you. They get a cut. It depends on the kind of deals they have with the companies they're working out deals with. But they work for you. They're very good at what they do. It helps to get started in the industry. It helps when you're in the slow period. The ones I work with are the Creative Group in San Jose, 8020, Talent Avenue, but there's a whole bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of different ones. When I lived in Los Angeles, there's like Aquent or something and a couple of other ones. Learn to program, right? So if you're a designer that just does UI, great. If you're a designer that just does UX, great. If you're a designer like me that does UI UX, That's already better, right? Because now you can think laterally across different mediums and solve a vastly larger amount of problems. If you're a designer like me that understands some database stuff and understands some coding stuff, you're vastly better than just a designer because now you can sit with developers and help them troubleshoot their problems. And you can sometimes solve days because engineers only thinking about a problem from his development standpoint, right? He doesn't realize that maybe this entire flow doesn't need to be built, or that there's a new library that you found as a designer that you can recommend to them, right? To save them time. Or maybe you can just design your UI UX, understanding what kind of pieces of code they get for free, and again save them a whole lot of time, right? Or understand the pain they would go through if you don't label your assets correctly and you don't provide them a spec sheet, when they have to go through thing by thing, not knowing art and design, and trying to figure out what you meant by just put it together. So, yeah, the process is basically comprised of the UI UX guys on the GUI side. Then there's the code, which is comprised of what I call the front of the front end, kind of the XML on Android. Java is kind of the core, but a lot of the UI work is done on the Java XML, right? And then there's a backend section, which is basically the GUI talking to the server, and then the server is they're running their own code and they're trying to communicate with the application. So if you know some of this stuff, as I mentioned earlier, what's great about it is you can say, okay, I may not know how I would tell an app to integrate with an app store or something like that, but I can go in and do a light reskin, change some hex colors, right? Move a button over a couple of density independent points. And all that can both save your team a lot of time, and it can also allow you to be more precise with your design work, right? I can jump in, I can make an asset, I can put it in the correct position, I can commit it, and again, the developers can be safe to work on things they know how to do better that take them considerably more time. Lastly, the Silicon Valley is ripe with innovation, and it's not just mobile app design that I'm familiar with that's happening here. This is the center of the world, and we have things like Android Auto, VR, a whole slew of other technologies and services and hardware that are going to be relying on UI and UX designers. There are just going to be more of these jobs, not less. These are well-paying jobs. There are a lot of companies looking for people to do these jobs. There are very few people that are good at these jobs, right? There's a lot of people that will come to a company and say they know how to do Photoshop. And so then, your job as an interviewer is to try to weed out whether they're trying to BS you, right? Do you know design, or do you just know Photoshop? Do you know processes and guidelines, or do you just know Photoshop? Do you obsess and care about pixels and what's latest, greatest, hot, best practices, anti-patterns, all that mumbo jumbo? Or do you just know Photoshop, right? Because you don't want somebody who just knows Photoshop. Point being is it's a lot of fun. It's a wide open world. Look into it. One more thing. I mentioned that I was working on Sprocket, so we're right about done with a bicycle marketplace. We have an IMDb for bikes. We're about to ship away for peer-to-peer bicycle trading. So you can look up a bike near you. You can see what people want for it. You can make offers. You can list your bikes on the database. Download it, check it out, give us a rate, and that's about it. Thanks. I know my phone's dead, but did we completely go over time, or were we like within 60 minutes?
This one is 20, and that one was like 40 something.
Yes. Okay. So we have time for QA. Is that thing still running?
Yes. You
Good.
want to stop it?
No.
Okay.
So we can have questions that you guys ask me that I can answer, or we can have a discussion. I'd love to geek out about Android versus iOS and things that you guys find frustrating.
I had a question. How do you feel about, you haven't mentioned Illustrator, so I was curious because you picked Photoshop, which is like a pixel-based program over the vector-based.
Yeah. Um, there's a couple of things. Basically, very good question. I've looked into switching over to Illustrator at one point in my life because I was so frustrated with Photoshop. And actually, Illustrator is great for things like wireframes. Uh, More so, it's great for things like graphic design and vector illustration. For example, this logo was done in Illustrator. That's a perfect use of Illustrator to do that. The thing is that Illustrator is a vector-based program, so inherently it's not a pixel-based program. So it's difficult to get things to be pixel perfect because when you're designing the Illustrator environment, they're not really on a pixel grid as much, they're more amorphous. And it is less of an issue now, but when I was looking into it, phones were just going from 1x to 2x, and to like XX HDPI. So if things were off pixel, you wouldn't see it necessarily in Illustrator, but you would end up landing on half pixels. So you end up having either hairy pixels or blurry pixels, and you would be able to tell on your mobile phone that there's something awfully wrong with this icon, especially if it was in a prominent position. The other thing that Illustrator screwed up is that their rendering engine seems to have some kind of rounding mistake in it. And the Django blog, I believe, really went in depth on this and said like, hey guys, your shit is broken, fix it, and then they kind of never fixed it. If you were to render a circle that is really small and try to export it, you would actually see that it flatterizes the edges instead of dithering them correctly. And if it does that for just that kind of bitmap asset, it would screw up like everything that had any kind of alpha on it. Ultimately, I worked at one company that used it as their main tool over Photoshop. And the other thing that I found frustrating about it is in Photoshop, it was at least elementarily easy once you figured out how to navigate the art space and drill down into content or select content. In Illustrator, its layer system worked completely in a different way. And it makes a lot of sense when you start to work with really complicated illustrations. Like I did a set of golden apples for a client because they have like a rating system, like 5 golden apples win a bite at a blast or something like that, or chunks flying. So that involved a lot of masking and a lot of different layers of the gold, surfacing. So there, I saw why the layers are set up the way they're set up in Illustrator. But when you're trying to do high fidelity comps in Illustrator, you end up like clicking through a lot of layers and just a lot of things are counterproductively set up to do that work. So I would not recommend Illustrator as much as you can select marquee, a whole bunch of your canvas to select a whole bunch of elements and move them. You can choose groups, so you can choose elements and groups in Photoshop. It's just faster to do in Photoshop, believe it or not, even though Photoshop is another fast program. I guess.
So what about versus games?
Versus games? Okay. Is that for Illustrator or just UI, UX in general?
Just general.
Okay. So the good news is that games run on the same phone hardware that apps run on. So the same principles in terms of density and points apply. The other side of it is that in the game, because you're trying to be entertaining and you're trying to compete aesthetically with your competitors, and you're trying to kind of match the look and feel that the game is going after, you can be much more liberal and free in your use of UI elements. And you're mostly trying to create a system that's unique to that game rather than trying to make something that is universal across multiple apps and works well with the OS. It's kind of like you're diving into your own experience a lot of the time. Some of the same principles apply. So like I mentioned, button sizes, because you're still on the same hardware, you're still constrained by the same physical limitations. You still want to make your video game buttons the same size. You still want to use the same aspects of graphic design, like good gestalt, typography, use of color, like never ever put red text on the black background. You've seen it. And I've also seen games do some really beautiful stuff with some elements of material design and iOS guidelines. Like there's a game called Dots, so it's just like dots moving on screen. Yeah, basically, I would say the most important thing is like being critical of things that don't work UI or UX wise in your video game and kind of user testing them and troubleshooting them, because believe it or not, you can still end up in situations where in a video game where you're supposed to do some complicated sequence or you're supposed to navigate some series of screens and they still end up being screwed up in a way that confuses the gamer. So being cognizant of that. Yep.
Okay, so what about color? So say you're starting a brand new app, like it doesn't have a logo yet, it doesn't have whatever. How do you go about choosing the colors for everything?
Okay, so as far as applications go, if you don't have anything set up, then you're doing the pure graphic design aspect of it first before you get into UI. So you're setting up and defining the brand. And in terms of Sprocket here, it took me a little while to figure out what my brand was, but it's steeped in very specific aspects of the culture and the community that I serve that are different than, say, if I was to do a burger joint app or a car app, right? What do cyclists see all the time? They see and want infrastructure that's made out of green bike lanes, right? They want to be environmentally conscious and help the planet, right? They, in some ways, lean more left with the kinds of like green movements, right, that are up and coming in a lot of countries. So for all those reasons, green is a very important brand element in the service that I provide. So it started to define kind of the color choices that I was going to use. I think the next color I had was that carrot orange. So I had to do a secondary color, and one use of it was in search. When you have a whole bunch of bikes listed, you need a scroll bar that goes up and down. You need a tooltip, right? If you fast scroll, you get letters that tell you what section of these 400 items you're on. And while I could have chosen any color, I ended up going with orange because it felt vibrant and gold, kind of like sunset. So it had a good look and feel, right? I tried it out in a bunch of sections of my interface that I had already built at that point. And I also wanted to pay a little homage to my design work at SoundHound because that was an entirely orange app. But basically, you end up having 3 colors, essentially. You end up having 2 main colors when you're looking at something like material design, and a couple of secondary colors and maybe tertiary colors. Secondary colors are used in like smaller UI elements, like I mentioned, scroll bars, maybe some secondary buttons or something like that. And tertiary colors are like maybe what you would use for a positive confirmation check mark would be like a tertiary green if your app is not green, right? And you might have a tertiary red color if you have like red error messages come up now and again, like you have in Sprocket. So what you could do is you could say, like I did for Sprocket, that my business was going to be mobile-based and that I was going to start by building a mobile application and by defining my brand based on my app icon and the needs of my user interface. Then say if I was a website company or, again, a tractor company or something like that. So when I designed my symbol in Illustrator, I then designed my icon. And then once I got the look and feel of the icon to be great, I figured out that its core colors were going to be green and white, and I thought about how they were going to apply to my interface before I finalized on the decision to use those as my brand colors. Long answer.
I have a question. So how do you go about like adding the animations into the mobile app? Like, do you have all the keyframes in Photoshop of like what's happening? Or
Good question.
okay.
So there's a couple of different ways. When I was working on an animation for SoundHound, I used After Effects.
Oh, okay.
When I was working on some other aspect, I prototyped with Quartz Composer, which you can get a little more programming with. And there's a whole bunch of other applications that I use for prototyping animations. Ultimately, a lot of what I've been involved due to the needs of most companies have been UI, UX, and maybe code-based, and I've not been as much involved in animations personally. But when I do deal with this and other references I have, I will go and say, oh, this thing would work great here, do this in this way here, and usually it can get away with it. At some companies, it's now becoming a whole thing to be an interface animation designer. So like Google has positions for animators to just animate application interfaces, right? So for anyone that's not in digital arts or the digital arts part, but they're majoring in animation at Cogswell, they can actually major in animation and then go work in UI, which is exciting that that's now happening. And that's happening both for Android and Apple, as I've said with Facebook Paper, which has those beautiful animations.
So you would render it out as a PNG sequence and give that to the programmer? I'm just like after you have it in After Effects.
Yeah, you're asking me about the deliverable. When I did the After Effects stuff, I actually had the values for the animation in After Effects that I was able to relate to them.
Mm.
And I also had the animation itself that they could play over and over, so they can try to kind of match it up.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, what I did on Sprocket was I had the search fab, and I wanted to highlight it in the state of the bicycle marketplace when there are no bikes. So I had like waves that would fade out around it. And so for that, because it was a really simple animation that consisted of like a start state and an end state, I actually did provide, several screenshots that basically match this. It's this DP value when it starts. It's this DP value when it ends in this opacity. It is this hex code.
So just programmatically?
Hmm?
So just programmatically have them do it?
Yeah, I just had them match the still comps and the very rudimentary specs. But that's a very simple animation. I think the other thing is, at least as far as I work with animations, you can start out with something, it will look pretty damn good, and then you can kind of match it up instead of trying to be perfect every time the first time. The other thing that's great about animation is with Android specifically, because meaningful motion is such a big aspect of what makes material design sing. They have guidelines for how to animate. They have guidelines for easing in and out. Like if you have a grid of things, how they should percolate, as a wave instead of all at the same time. And all of those guidelines can both be referenced by you as a designer, and they can also be sent over to a developer working on a specific thing. And you're like, oh, you're animating this thing, by the way, here's the guideline for the ease in and out for you to reference. Or here's the guideline for how this quantum paper should come together and become one piece of one element.
Cool.
I came mostly just for like UI on shopping. We're gonna game, so you're talking about the game portion really helped, but I can't think of it. Like,
Contribute.
There's not that many people, so I just wanted to let you into something. Cool. Thanks so much. Again, it's been a pleasure. It was a lot of fun to make this presentation. I actually taught myself a few things when I was working. Have a good night.